Right, so let's start off. So I wanted to, again, the premise behind what are we trying to do here, I'm sorry for repeating it over and over again, but we're trying to share our methodologies, we're trying to share models, we're trying to have implementable things. But one of the things that Gotti told me at the very end was make sure we don't leave without having very clear things that we know what we're going to do after the conference, okay? And so it's important that we try to meet that objective, not just because Gotti wants it, but because really I want to make sure that we feel like we've contributed to something useful and that when we look back on the conference and when we come back next year, we can say, oh, I contributed to that too, okay? And so I wanted to frame what I'm talking about and what does that look like, I wanted to do a quick case study to explain what this looks like. And some of y'all heard me talk about it yesterday, but I don't know if everyone got the full context because the content I shared, because a lot of people didn't know what the cyber defense matrix was. Okay, so can I get a quick show of hands again? Who has seen the cyber defense? Who has not seen the cyber defense matrix? One, two, like more than half the room. Okay, so if you, for the folks who've already seen it, forgive me for hitting upon it again, but I'm going to just give a really quick overview and explain what it was that Guillaume did that, that really fits the theme of what we're trying to accomplish within Art into Science. So the presentation I gave last year, which I posted online, which I posted on Slack, I presented a scientific model for cybersecurity. I said, hey, here's the model that I think helps describe our space and describe it really well. And I made suggestions as to why we need a model. And ultimately, I tried to explain, when we look at scientific models, these are the things that we're looking for. And one of the things that we want to look for is to make predictions, okay? So the second box on the left, I said, I want to make predictions based on this model. And so one of the predictions I made is what Guillaume actually went and tried to figure out, okay? So let me explain the model real quickly. The model is really trying to make sense of our security, our space, where you see a lot of buzzwords, but the buzzwords really don't fit into a nice orderly pattern. And the orderly pattern that I created was based on two dimensions. On one dimension, things that I care about. On the other dimension, things that I do. And the things that I do is the NIST cybersecurity framework, okay? So you take these two dimensions and you end up with this matrix, this 5x5 matrix. Things that I care about, things that I do. And you get a 5x5. What I did was what you see on the bottom is a prediction that I made. It's a hypothesis that says, I believe that the distribution of people, process, and technology looks like what you see there, where on the function of identify, we have a little bit of people doing the work. We should rely more on technology, and we should have basically a consistent amount of process throughout all the different phases, okay? And as you go from left to right, you see this dependency decrease on technology and increase on people. And so what Guillaume did was he went through and said, OK, well, let me see if that actually turns out to be true. And yes, we were looking at spreadsheets, but ultimately, the point of the spreadsheets was to see if he can collect the data to prove out whether or not that distribution makes sense, OK? And so the case study here I'm presenting is to say, last year, I had the opportunity to present this to the group. We didn't really dig into it much afterwards in a deep dive. And we didn't dig into it to say, well, what does this really mean? And how do you actually calculate these values and all these sort of things? We instead talked about things that were not hinged to the briefings that people gave. We talked about how do you come up with a different risk model? How do you come up with a new lexicon or whatever else it was? We came up with these other topics that were not tied to the discussions, the briefings that people brought forward. What I wanted to do differently this year was to ensure that we hinged it on topics that people actually talked about. So that's why we aligned the deep dive discussions around topics that were brought up. So in the context of, let me explain now, what would we have done differently last year if someone said, hey, we need a new lexicon? What I would have preferred is to say, how would a lexicon fit within how would the lexicon that we use today fit in the context of this model? Okay? Or we need a new risk model. Okay, how would that risk model, how would that match up against something like this? Or where does that fit? Okay? And ultimately, in asking that question and noodling through that, what we end up with is, does this model actually work? Can we improve upon this model? Can we improve upon this framework and advance the field forward? So that was the idea, and that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish today as well. There was a lot of really great content that was presented yesterday, and what I hope to achieve today is to have some further discussions around how do we further those frameworks, and we engage the people who presented to be on point for actually ensuring that the work continues after this conference. Okay? And just as a quick point of reference, one of the things that I provided to the group afterwards was I gave a bunch of other things for further consideration. So I said, okay, now that I have this matrix, I need to do a lot of interesting things. For example, I want to calculate metrics for each of these things. Okay? And so it provided opportunities to say, well, if you want to take the work that we've done and further it, here's a way that you guys can engage. Okay, so the talks that we had yesterday, it didn't quite do that. We didn't have a direct, not every talk had a direct, and here's the further work for consideration. If you look at academic papers, there's almost always a section at the end that says, for further exploration, for further work, these are the next steps. And they asked the community to go figure out, hey, how do we actually tackle these next things? So that's essentially what I did here. And I said, look, I need metrics for these things. I'm actually very happy, for example, for Frank and for Joe yesterday to talk about, let me figure out how to do tool metrics, okay? Because whatever they figure out now fits into something that I have here, which is I want to be able to calculate the efficacy of different tools. Or another case where I'm trying to figure out the half-life or the effectiveness time frame for a given tool or for a given training or whatever else it may be. So in each of these cases, I've put numbers that says, I think training a person to do endpoint detection has a half-life of a year, which means after a year, their efficacy at that decreases by 50%. And so every year, if you want to increase that back to 100%, you have to continually pour energy into the system. And if you are okay with degrading your capability down to 50%, then you don't need to continue to put investment in. But most people will probably take the option to invest in keeping their technology capabilities up or their people skills up and so on and so forth. So, but you see that big yellow box. It says illustrative, okay? Which means that I made my best guess at this. And what we need is to be able to think about, well, how do we measure, how do we capture the half-life of a given process or a given skill set or a given technology? So the basic, I bring all this up to say, last year when I presented this, it was really to throw out there to say, guys, I'm trying to work through this myself. I would love for collaboration on this to understand how do we capture, systematically capture this information using frameworks, using methodologies that we may use it within our own shops, but maybe it doesn't have a home, okay? And so that's what I presented last year. I did not do a deep dive on this last year. I did not schedule a deep dive for this today or tomorrow, mostly because it would seem quite self-serving. But I wanted to at least give context around what are we trying to accomplish and how are we trying to accomplish it so that you understand how it fits into why we're doing it the way we're doing it today. Okay, so any questions on any of this so far? Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So the topics that I teed up Okay, so now we're at 9:40, right on time. And I proposed topics, but frankly, I want to make sure it's clear. It's the word, the operative word here is proposed, okay? Meaning, I picked what got the most discussion going per the Slack channels. And the ones that got the most discussion, the first two, the professionalization discussion and the product testing discussion got by far the most discussion, okay? And so I think it's worthwhile considering how do we build upon that further. I've asked Andrea and I've asked Thomas to help us dig further into that. The product testing framework is another one that also came up. Joe presented it, Frank and Steve, Chris. Frank and Chris have not presented theirs yet, but they're going to present that later this afternoon. So I believe it's worth considering deep diving into that as well. The deception framework, we actually haven't talked about much. Josh started it. There's a turbo talk today on, with Guy, who's going to, I'm sorry, Guy, who's going to talk about some really interesting work he's been doing there. And then in homage to Gotti, I figured, hey, I'm sure he would actually appreciate having some discussion around this as well. So I throw it out there as a proposed discussion, but by no means is this fixed. You may wonder, why did I not choose these other ones? And the only reason why is not because we didn't get a lot of discussion, but rather I wasn't clear either on who would lead it, and we want to make sure that there's two leads. There's a co-lead and there are two co-leads because we all get busy. And then what I didn't quite understand was like what is the framework that we want to build out. So if there were topics that were discussed yesterday for which you believe, hey, we ought to deep dive on this, then I solicit those comments now to say, what should we consider? Okay? So any questions on any questions, first of all? Yeah.
So the one question is just about framework. I was involved in one with the Federal Reserve, and it languished. It ended up becoming useful, but it got highly academic. So in lots of comments and other things to actually make it something tangible. It started off as an open, like a TOGAF framework, and then it kind of went into principles, and then it went into procedures. So any guidance there would be helpful, just because I don't want it to languish. I would like it to be useful. Then the other one is just maybe a thought on the hazard assessment framework. The forecasting component of that, I think, is quite useful. So while it's not one of the four, I think it should be considered further.
Okay. So to your first point about how do we not let it languish, I'm involved in a number of standards bodies, and it is quite frustrating to navigate that. I'm actually very much of a proponent of, I'm much more of a proponent of de facto standards, because it means that people are actually using them. And I would say for any of these frameworks that we're talking about here, I have no inclination to make them a formal, hey, everyone has to use this type of framework. If it's useful for us, hey, we've accomplished something that I think has advanced the field forward. If it becomes a de facto framework, or if it becomes an official framework, great, all the better. The 5x5 matrix that I showed you guys is by no means an official framework, but NIST is looking at adopting it. And that's great, right? Because we have over like 200 organizations using it now. So, and it's not because it was formally declared as anything, but because we as practitioners said we find that useful. So that's kind of the angle that I'm trying to take, so that it doesn't languish. Rather, I'll put it this way, if it languishes, it's our own fault because we didn't build it out in the way that we found it to be useful. if that makes sense. So some things are going to be a little harder. Like, for example, professionalization framework, that's a much bigger problem. And I wonder, well, actually, the practical implementation of that may be just within our own organization. How will we split up our different functions so that it becomes to look more like a professional organization? Who knows? Those are going to be really interesting discussions that we'll have. As far as the forecasting framework, I'll throw it out there and put that for consideration. I'm not sure what that still looks like, but later on today, I reserve time to really figure out what do we want to carve out of these frameworks, like what is it that we want to define, and then start working through those. I also, you see that I don't have anything working in parallel. I'm not sure if folks want to do it all at once together as a group, and we'll have little breakouts within the same topic, or if folks want to actually do it multitask. Again, you know what, actually maybe we can do a quick vote, but who's interested in each one of these things? So I'm not doing a scientific thing. I just want to get a general sense. So who's interested in the first one, the professionalization framework? Okay, and then who's interested in the product testing framework? Okay. Deception? Okay, and then the forecasting framework? Okay, all right. Okay, so some of these we may actually be able to split up then, because I saw a couple ones that people said, you know what, I'm interested in this, but not this. So let me figure out what that is, and maybe I'll have a poll. I'll create a quick poll within Slack so that we can actually make it a bit more organized there. Were there other frameworks? So I mentioned also the Red Team one, and Toby, I kind of look at you for this one too. But are there other ones that we talked about? Were there topics that we talked about yesterday that you think deserves attention as a group? Or rather, you personally, and forget about the group, you personally want to deep dive into something that you'd like to create a framework around. Okay. All right. And if you're shy, if you're a bunch of introverts, which mostly people in philosophy track are, then just shoot me a note on Slack, and we'll think about that. Okay. All right. So okay. So next up, then. So at this point, the 4 themes that we'll try to figure out how to handle in the afternoon, and some of this will run over probably into day 3. The 4 will be the top 4 that we see here. Okay. Was there anything on the red team piece that we thought we wanted to create a framework around? My main question here was, I'm not sure what is the framework itself that we want to create, if anything. So.
I was going to volunteer to participate in the hazard.
Okay. The forecasting
one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And by the way, I don't know if Kelly's still here, but that's the other thing. We need a second lead for that one. Okay, so because ultimately we're looking to hinge it on somebody who actually cares about that topic enough to build content around it. Okay. Oh, well, the discussion was spurred on by Toby's talk on red teaming not just being about attacking, but the question, people actually enjoyed Toby's talk. It had a lot of discussion that emerged from it, but what was absent, what I couldn't discern, was what do we want to, what kind of framework or what kind of material do we want to create out of it? Okay. So a lot of discussion, great, but was there some artifact that we wanted to draw out of it? And that's what I wasn't sure about. Does that make sense? And again,
It makes sense. And the thing is, it's just when you talk about red team, there are so many different ways you can go with it.
yeah,
That
yeah.
making a centralized framework is tough because you talk about, do you want to try to act like an actor? Do you want to try to replicate an actor? Well, the problem is which actor? And so there's so many different ways you can take it that it becomes a little bit.
That's kind of the point of setting it up as a framework, is that you don't bother specifying which actor. You talk about the two core functions of the red team, namely attack modeling and alternative analysis, and you focus on how you teach one or the other of those skills. I was talking with a couple of people yesterday after being after the talk, and we were discussing how you go about teaching critical skills, and specifically teaching awareness when your critical skills are slipping, which is really a bigger issue for almost everyone.
Because it's scary. It's kind of, just with personal experience, it's kind of scary to consider what to do as a red team and how far to go as a red team and how you can, what you can do that starts to breach that line between what is legitimate and what is not. And so teaching that kind of critical thinking skill is tough, and it's not out there already.
It's the different path you get anyway. So those are the sorts of things you can get into with a
Yeah.
Okay. So again, there was a really lively discussion on the topic. The question was, how do we want to frame it? That's really fundamentally the question. How are we framing this in such a way that we can, the output can be some artifact that people can use? And so there's enough discussion on it that I thought it was worth bringing up, but I wasn't sure exactly how to frame it. Okay. And if someone can figure it out, then by all means, let's have that discussion. Okay, so those are the topics. I'm going to let that sink in, and I'm going to have, again, I welcome the feedback because this is something that we all want to build out together. To give some time between what I just said and getting that feedback in preparation for the actual deep dive framework objectives discussion at 10:50, I wanted to throw in a couple turbo talks. So I've asked Steve and Guy to give us a couple quick turbo talk. Guy, if I may ask us to just switch real quickly. Steve has a call at 10:30, so I'll have him go first, and then Guy will follow up after that.